can't believe this is happening.
I did not mean to.
Monkey. The word dropped like a grenade in the quiet luxury of first class. Passengers froze, their glasses half raised, the hum of the engines suddenly deafening. The uniformed pilot, someone expected to embody authority and professionalism, had just spat the slur at a young black woman who sat clutching her handbag, her knuckles white with shock. Gasps rippled down the cabin. A mother shielded her child's ears. Phones lifted instantly, their cameras capturing what no one could believe they were witnessing. And then, before anyone could react, a tall figure stepped through the curtain from business class. Her husband, the CEO of the very airline this pilot worked for. Her name was Amara Johnson. She wasn't just any passenger. She was a lawyer, a woman who had fought her way through doors that people tried to slam shut in her face all her life. The daughter of a school teacher and a postal worker, Amara had grown up knowing what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated, and disrespected. Her parents had instilled in her the belief that education and determination could break chains. But she had also learned that no degree or salary could erase prejudice from the hearts of some. This trip wasn't supposed to be a battlefield. It was meant to be a celebration, a short getaway with her husband after years of relentless work. She had dressed simply, chosen a seat by the window, and carried a book instead of a laptop, determined to let her mind rest. First class was her small reward, not for wealth or status, but for surviving everything it had taken to get here. But prejudice had followed her, even into the sky. She sat frozen, replaying the pilot's words in her mind, her heart pounding. Her husband's hand gripped hers tightly, steadying her. He hadn't planned to reveal who he was, not here, not like this, but the insult had torn away the luxury of silence. The other passengers were restless now, some murmuring angrily, others pulling out their phones to ensure the truth wouldn't be buried. A few glanced at Amara with guilt in their eyes, as though silently apologizing for not standing up sooner. The pilot shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their stares. Just minutes ago, he had walked into first class with the arrogance of someone untouchable. But arrogance was cracking into desperation, even as he tried to cover it with authority. "Sir," he said sharply, addressing the CEO now, "this is a misunderstanding." "Your wife, don't," the CEO cut him off, his voice like steel. "Don't you dare try to explain away what everyone in this cabin just heard." A hush fell again, heavier than before. The flight attendants lingered near the galley, exchanging nervous looks. They had trained for turbulence, medical emergencies, even unruly passengers, but not for a moment like this. Their captain, the man they were supposed to obey without question, had just crossed a line that could end his career. Amara's eyes filled, but this time with something different. Not shame, not fear, but the sharp sting of rage mixed with vindication. For years, she had been forced to swallow words like that, forced to carry herself with dignity even as others tried to strip it away. But this time was different. This time, her husband was standing right beside her, and the balance of power wasn't just shifting, it was about to collapse entirely. Passengers leaned in, waiting. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The stage was set, the players in position. The pilot had thought he could humiliate one woman. What he didn't realize was that the fallout of his arrogance was about to be far greater than he could ever imagine. The cabin was no longer just a place of quiet luxury. It had become a courtroom, and every passenger was both witness and jury. The silence stretched unbearably, a taut string threatening to snap. Every passenger's gaze was pinned to the confrontation. The pilot, standing stiff and defiant, and the CEO, his presence radiating quiet authority. The air was charged, thick with anticipation. Amara inhaled shakily, her chest rising and falling as she fought to steady her pulse. The sting of the word still burned in her ears. She had heard it before, in playgrounds, in boardrooms, even in whispered tones at charity galas, but never with such brazen audacity, and never from someone tasked with carrying hundreds of lives safely through the skies. The pilot shifted his cap, his jaw tightening as though to reclaim his dignity. "Sir," he repeated, his voice lower now, almost pleading, "I meant no offense. These situations can be misinterpreted. The CEO's words cracked through the cabin like a whip. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. My wife was sitting here, quietly minding her own business, and you, an officer of this airline, called her a monkey. Do you deny it? Dozens of phones tilted forward, catching every flicker of expression. The pilot's eyes darted around as if calculating how much had been recorded, how much he could still deny. But the murmurs swelling in the cabin told him the truth. Everyone had heard it. A young woman in the second row spoke up, her voice trembling but resolute. I recorded everything. We all heard it. Don't try to pretend you didn't. Gasps of agreement rippled through the cabin. Heads nodded. Another passenger, a businessman with silver hair, muttered loudly enough for all to hear. Unbelievable. From a pilot, no less. Amara lowered her gaze for a moment, her hands gripping her knees. Part of her wanted to disappear, to shrink from the spectacle. But another part, a stronger part, knew that silence would only let the insult take root. She lifted her head, meeting the pilot's eyes directly. You didn't just insult me, she said, her voice calm but carrying steel beneath it. You insulted every black woman who has fought her way into spaces people like you tried to keep us out of. You insulted your passengers who trusted you to be a professional. You insulted the very uniform you wear, the words landed like strikes. The pilot flinched, his arrogance flickering under the heat of her gaze. Her husband straightened, his presence towering. Captain, he said coldly, you've not only disgraced yourself, you've endangered this airline. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? The realization spread through the cabin like wildfire. Whispers grew urgent, passengers connecting the dots. This man wasn't just a husband. He was the CEO. The power dynamics had shifted completely. The man the pilot thought he could belittle's wife was married to the one person who could decide his future with a single word. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, some already stepping forward, as though instinctively aligning themselves with the CEO. Loyalty was shifting, visible in every subtle movement. The pilot, realizing the precariousness of his position, forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sir, perhaps I spoke out of turn. Stress, long hours. Stress does not excuse racism, the CEO cut in sharply. You had a choice. You chose to dehumanize a passenger. My wife. His voice dropped, quieter now, yet somehow more dangerous. And now the world is watching. The passengers' phones remained poised like weapons, the red dots of recording lights unwavering. The pilot's throat bobbed as he swallowed, sweat glistening at his temples. Amara, though still trembling inside, felt a shift within herself. For so long she had carried the burden of ignoring, of smiling through insults, of proving her worth again and again. But in this moment she wasn't alone. Justice had a voice, hers and her husband's, amplified by every witness in this cabin. She leaned closer to her husband, her voice low but firm. Don't let him bury this. He met her eyes, his own gaze steady, resolute. I won't. The rising storm inside the cabin had reached its peak. Every passenger could feel it. Something irreversible had been set in motion. The pilot's career, his reputation, his very identity as an untouchable figure of authority was unraveling before their eyes, and this was only the beginning. The cabin had become an arena. The rows of plush leather seats were no longer symbols of luxury, but witness stands in a trial that had unfolded miles above the earth. Every eye was locked on the pilot, every phone raised like a silent jury recording the evidence. The pilot's face flushed crimson, a storm of anger and fear battling behind his eyes. He had been the unquestioned authority on this plane, the captain, the man whose word was law at 35,000 feet. Yet now, that authority was crumbling, stripped bare by the gaze of 100 passengers and the presence of one man who stood taller than his uniform. Sit down. Captain, the CEO ordered, his voice calm but edged with steel. You are no longer in command of this flight. The words detonated in the cabin. Gasps, murmurs, a wave of disbelief. A flight attendant instinctively stepped forward. Sir, with respect, the CEO interrupted, turning his gaze on her. This man just disgraced your airline, endangered your passengers' trust, and violated every code of professionalism he swore to uphold. He is done. Now. The authority in his tone silenced the cabin crew. They had trained their entire careers to follow the captain's orders, but this was no ordinary passenger challenging authority. This was the man who signed their paychecks, who could make or break the very company that employed them. The unshakable chain of command had just been shattered. The pilot stiffened. "You have no right." "I have every right," the CEO snapped, his voice booming now. "I built this airline from the ground up. I command its future. And you just destroyed yours with one word." The passengers erupted in agreement. "That's right." Someone shouted from row 3, "Unbelievable!" Another echoed, "Fire him!" A woman demanded, her voice trembling with indignation. The cabin pulsed with energy, passengers leaning forward, their outrage no longer confined to whispers. The slur that had once hung heavy in the air was now met with collective fury, a tide of justice rising around Amara. The pilot's mask cracked. His lips trembled as he tried to regain control. "You don't understand. People blow things out of proportion these days. I didn't mean it like that." "You meant it," Amara cut in, her voice steady and resonant. She rose from her seat, her figure commanding, her eyes locked onto him with unflinching fire. "You meant to diminish me. You meant to remind me of the place you thought I belonged. But here's the truth." She gestured around the cabin. "This isn't your kingdom." "Not anymore." Her words drew a thunder of applause, passengers clapping, some even standing in solidarity. The sound filled the cabin, drowning out the roar of the engines. The CEO stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the pilot. He didn't raise his voice now. He didn't need to. His words were quiet, lethal in their finality. "When we land," he said, "you will be stripped of your wings. You will never sit in a cockpit again. And every passenger on this plane will have proof of why." The pilot staggered back, as though the ground itself had tilted beneath him. His authority, his career, his identity, obliterated in a single moment. The applause grew louder, rolling like thunder through the cabin. Some passengers had tears in their eyes, moved not just by the confrontation, but by the vindication. The rare sight of justice unfolding in real time. Amara stood tall, her hand gripping her husband's. For years, she had carried scars that no one else could see, wounds carved by casual cruelty and unspoken prejudice. But now, for the first time, the weight of those wounds felt lighter. Because this time, she had not been forced to suffer in silence. This time, the world had heard, and the world had answered. The cabin slowly quieted, though the electricity in the air remained. The applause faded into murmurs, into the hushed buzz of passengers replaying the scene in their minds. Phones stayed raised, screens glowing like embers. The evidence of what had happened here would not vanish into silence. The pilot, stripped of his authority, slumped into an empty seat near the galley. His eyes darted nervously, hands twitching as though searching for words that could rewind the last 10 minutes. But there were no words left. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. Amara sat down, her husband's hand warm in hers. Her chest still rose and fell with the echoes of adrenaline, but inside, something deeper had settled. Not peace, not yet, but clarity. She had spent her life knowing moments like these often ended in denial, in gaslighting, in excuses that left her questioning her own reality. But this time there were witnesses. This time, truth had been recorded. The flight attendants moved with unusual stiffness, offering drinks and meals with trembling hands. Their loyalty had shifted entirely. Every glance toward Amara was laced with guilt, apology, even admiration. They knew history had just been written in this cabin, and they had been caught in its pages. As the plane descended toward its destination, the captain's voice did not echo through the intercom. For the first time in their careers, the crew had locked their commander out of his own role. Instead, the first officer, a young woman with steady hands and steady voice, took control. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice came through, clear and professional, "this is your first officer speaking. We'll be making our initial descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts. On behalf of the crew, I thank you for your patience." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who once believed himself untouchable had been silenced, replaced, his authority shattered midair. The wheels touched the runway with a screech of metal and rubber. Applause broke out again, not for the landing itself, but for what it represented, Closure. Justice, inching closer with every second. As the aircraft rolled to the gate, passengers unbuckled early, phones in hand, ready to upload the moment the doors opened. The world outside was waiting, though none of them could yet fathom just how fast the storm would spread. The CEO stood, his presence commanding even in the mundane bustle of landing. He turned to the nearest flight attendant. "Security will be waiting at the gate. This man," he gestured toward the disgraced pilot, "will not leave this airport without being escorted. Make the arrangements." "Yes, sir," she stammered, nodding quickly. Amara rose slowly, her legs steady now, her gaze sweeping over the passengers who still watched her. Some offered small nods of solidarity. Others whispered, "Thank you," as though her courage had somehow given them a voice too. She didn't smile. Not yet. The wound was still raw, but she did straighten her shoulders, reclaiming the dignity the pilot had tried to strip away. The jet bridge was chaos. Cameras flashed as soon as the first passengers disembarked. News outlets had already caught wind of the story. Tweets and live streams had gone viral while they were still in the air. By the time Amara stepped out, she wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was the center of a global storm. Reporters shouted questions. What happened on board? Is it true the pilot used a racial slur? How does it feel knowing the world is behind you? Amara's husband raised a hand, shielding her as best he could. "You'll have our statement soon," he said firmly. "For now, my wife deserves peace." The pilot emerged minutes later, flanked by airport security. The crowd erupted, boos, jeers, flashes of phones. His face was pale, sweat soaking through his collar. He tried to speak, but the noise drowned him out. For the first time in his career, he was no longer the man in control. Within hours, the footage was everywhere. News anchors dissected it. Social media platforms exploded with outrage. Hashtags trended across continents. "Ground the pilot, justice for Amara. Racism at 35,000 feet. The airline released a swift statement distancing itself from the captain. Effective immediately, Captain James Harlan has been terminated. His actions do not reflect the values of our airline or our commitment to every passenger's dignity. But the world already knew. They had seen the truth with their own eyes. Weeks later, Amara stood at a podium, her husband by her side. The room was packed with journalists, activists, and leaders who had rallied behind her. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived through fire and walked out unburned. "This was never just about me," she said. "It was about every person who has been told, subtly or boldly, that they don't belong. It was about accountability in places where power has been abused, and it was about ensuring that silence is no longer the default response to injustice." The applause that followed wasn't just for her. It was for every silenced voice that had finally found an echo. Her husband placed a hand on hers, pride radiating in his eyes. She turned, meeting his gaze with quiet strength. The pilot's career had ended, but for Amara, this was not an ending. It was a beginning, a story not of humiliation, but of reclamation. The word that had once been meant to demean her had become the catalyst for change, and as she stepped down from the podium, the world no longer saw her as a victim. They saw her as what she had always been, unstoppable,